Hello everyone, in this module we are going to learn how to set grid line in polar chart, and the following are the topics that we are going to discuss. Firstly, we will understand about the radial grid lines, then we will discuss about the theta grid lines. So since you have seen that in earlier plots that we use the grid function to draw the grid lines in the Cartesian system, but now it's time when we learn about how we can set or draw the grid lines in polar chart. For this we have two grid lines, the radial grid lines and the angular grid lines. And to set the radial grids we use the rgrid function. It is a function used to set the radial grid lines on the polar chart, and the syntax for this is matplotlib.pyplot.rgrids, and following are the parameters that the function have. First one is radii. By default it has none value, and it will also take value as a tuple with float values, and the radii is the distance at which the radial grid line should be created. The next one is labels, and by default it has none value, but it take value as a tuple with string values, and it is a label that will be displayed in the radii grid. The next one is angle. By default it has none value, but it take value as a float, and it is the angle at which the labels are displayed, and by default angles are displayed at 22.5 degree. The next one is FMT, which has none as a default value, and it is used to format the grid structure. And the last one is keyword arguments. So let's see an example related to this. So here is the code to add radial grid lines. Firstly, I import libraries. The first library which I import is matplotlib.pyplot as plt. The next one is numpy as np. After that, I define the angle and the distance. For this, I use the theta variable and r variable. After that, I create a polar chart by calling a polar function, and I pass value theta and r to it. Then I set the grid line using the rgrids function, which is used to set the radial grid lines. For this, I pass the radii parameter and set its value using the np.arrange function. And we also pass the angle parameter and set its value to 180 degree. And after that I call the show function to display the plot. Now I execute this code, and here is the output. You can see that it only shows the radial grid lines, and it shows labels at angle 180 degree, as I mentioned here, angle 180 degree. So let's see what will happen if I don't use this function. So I comment it out. Now I execute it again, and you can see that now it has lots of grid lines. But when I use this function, the number of grid lines reduced. Now we will learn how to control angular grids. For this, we have theta grid function. Theta's grid function is used to set the theta grid line on the polar chart, and the syntax for this is matplotlib.pyplot.theta grids, and the following are the parameters that it has. The first one is labels, and by default it has none value, otherwise it take value as a tuple with string value, and the label that will be displayed in the radial grid lines are set by this parameter. The next one is angles. By default it has none value, and it will take value as a tuple with float value, and it is a angle of the theta grid line. The next one is FMT. By default it has none value, and the other one is keyword arguments. So let's see example related to this. So here is the code to add theta grid lines. For this I import library matplotlib.pyplot as plt. The next one is numpy as np. After that I define the angle and the distance for creating a polar chart. Then I call the polar function to create a polar chart, and here I pass theta and r variable which I defined above. Then I call the theta grids function to set theta grid lines on the plot. And here I pass an angle parameter and set its value by using the range function of Python. And in last I call the show function to display the plot. Now I execute this code, and here is the output. You can see that here it starts from 90, ends at 180, but with a gap of 20, and it only shows the grid lines in these angles. So we can say that it controls the angular grid line. What will happen if I comment out this line? You can see that it shows the angular grid lines in all over the plot by default one. So if I uncomment and execute it again, it will show you the angular grid lines only on the defined angle. So with this we learn to control radial and angular grid lines. So in the next module we will learn to create quiver plots.